This week we are covering antecedent approaches to treating problem behavior. Before we talk about antecedent approaches to decreasing problem behavior, I thought it might be helpful to review some terminology. We will start by defining and comparing discriminative stimuli and motivating operations, and then we will cover antecedent interventions that involve the manipulation of these variables. So, to review, a discriminative stimulus, or SD, is a stimulus in the presence of which a response has been reinforced, and in the absence of which the same response has not been reinforced. This differential reinforcement leads to a response being more likely in the presence of the SD and less likely in the presence of the S delta. As you will see on the following slide, the SD is part of a three-term contingency. In this example, which comes straight out of your Cooper textbook, we see that in the presence of a faucet marked with a blue dot or the letter C, turning the tap results in cold water being dispensed. The SD is the faucet marked with a C, the response is turning the tap, and the consequence is the addition of cold water. As you can see in this example, the SD signals the availability of a specific reinforcer for a specific response. Motivating operations are another type of antecedent stimulus. A motivating operation occurs before the behavior of interest and has evocative functions just like an SD. But how are the two different? Well, as was stated previously, an SD signals that reinforcement is available for a particular response. A motivating operation, on the other hand, momentarily changes the value of a stimulus as a reinforcer. It either leads to a stimulus becoming more or less reinforcing. Now you may remember that there are two types of motivating operations: establishing operations and abolishing operations. Establishing operations increase the effectiveness of a stimulus as a reinforcer and lead to the increase in behaviors that will result in that reinforcer. Abolishing operations decrease the effectiveness of a stimulus as a reinforcer and lead to the decrease in behaviors that will result in that reinforcer. Here we have a four-term contingency. The motivating operation that is in effect is that an individual is deprived of water for a long period of time. With this motivating operation in effect, the SD, which is the presence of the faucet, leads to the response, which is turning the faucet, and this leads to the consequence of water being delivered. We would expect that this tap-turning behavior occurs when the person wants water, i.e. is thirsty. Next, we will discuss how antecedent interventions manipulate motivating operations in order to produce meaningful changes in behavior. Now, in the literature, we often see the term antecedent interventions in reference to any antecedent-based interventions. However, as you will learn, different antecedent stimuli have different functions, and it is important to learn the distinction between different types of antecedent approaches. We might categorize antecedent stimuli as being either contingency dependent or contingency independent. With contingency dependent stimuli, the antecedent stimulus is dependent on the consequences of behavior for developing evocative and abative effects. A stimulus control paradigm in which a response is more or less likely in the presence of an antecedent stimulus due to a history of reinforcement or punishment would be categorized as contingency dependent. This is also referred to as antecedent control. With contingency independent stimuli, the antecedent stimulus is not dependent on consequences for its evocative or abative effects. Motivating operations fall into this category. This is referred to as an antecedent intervention. The remaining slides in this lecture will cover types of antecedent interventions. It is important to note that the effects of motivating operations are temporary. Manipulating motivating operations will not produce lasting effects, but can be manipulated alongside existing behavioral interventions to produce more lasting effects on behavior. The three types of antecedent interventions that will be covered in this lecture are non-contingent reinforcement, high probability request sequence, and functional communication training. Non-contingent reinforcement, or NCR, involves the delivery of reinforcers on a fixed time or variable time schedule independent of the learner's behavior. When non-contingent reinforcement procedures are in place, one may see a decrease in problem behavior as a result. The reason for this decrease in problem behavior is that an abolishing operation is in effect. The reinforcers that maintain problem behavior are available freely and frequently, and thus the reinforcer maintaining problem behavior loses its effectiveness as a reinforcer and makes problem behavior less likely. This procedure is also known as presenting stimuli with known reinforcing properties. In the behavior analytic literature, NCR has been demonstrated to decrease problem behavior when used with positive reinforcement, negative reinforcement, and automatic reinforcement paradigms. The first step in implementing a non-contingent reinforcement procedure is to determine the initial schedule that reinforcement will be delivered. To do this, the behavior analyst should divide the total duration of all baseline sessions by the total occurrences of problem behavior during baseline, and then set the initial interval at or slightly below the quotient. Once the NCR procedure produces a meaningful decrease in problem behavior, how does the behavior analyst begin to thin the delivery schedule? Schedule thinning involves adding small time increments to the NCR interval. There are three methods for thinning time-based schedules. One method is a constant time increase, where the interval is increased by a constant duration of time. The second method is using proportional time increases. With this method, the interval is increased proportionally, say by 20% each time. The third method is a session-to-session increase. This involves using the individual's performance as a guideline for increasing the interval. Therefore, the increase depends on the behavior of the learner, and the increase may vary accordingly. Another antecedent intervention is the high probability request sequence, also known as a high P request sequence. This involves the presentation of a series of easy-to-follow requests for which an individual has a history of compliance. When the learner complies with several of these high P requests, he or she is presented with the target request, or a low probability request. The high probability request sequence creates an abolishing operation, where the value of the reinforcer available for low probability requests is denied. What we see as a result is a decrease in problem behavior such as aggression and self-injury. The high probability request provides an alternative to aversive procedures for improving compliance and decreasing escape-maintained problem behaviors. The behavior analyst may also see a decrease in the latency in responding to requests and an increase in the time available for completing tasks. To implement the high probability request sequence, the behavior analyst should select 2 to 5 short tasks with which the individual has a history of compliance. These requests should be presented immediately before presenting the target task. It is important that the target task be presented in the same manner as the high probability requests. The high probability request sequence has been demonstrated in the literature. In 1983, Engelman and Colvin provided one of the earliest demonstrations. Since then, a number of researchers have investigated the effects of a high probability request sequence, including Horner et al. In 1991, which you read this week. A variety of terms have been used to refer to this intervention, including interspersed requests, pre-task requests, and behavioral momentum. Some of the key considerations of a successful high-probability sequence include selecting tasks from the learner's current repertoire, presenting those tasks rapidly, acknowledging compliance, and using potent reinforcers. A third antecedent intervention that we are covering is functional communication training, or FCT. FCT procedures establish an appropriate communication response to compete with problem behavior that is evoked by an establishing operation. FCT procedures develop alternative behaviors that are sensitive to the same EOs as problem behavior. In this way, FCT procedures differ from NCR and high probability request sequence procedures. FCR involves reinforcing an alternative behavior to the problem behavior. In this way, it is considered a differential reinforcement of alternative behaviors procedure, or DRA. This alternative behavior produces the reinforcer that is maintaining problem behavior. Responses might include vocalizations, signs, communication boards, and other forms. In 1985, Carr and Durand described FCT as a two-step process that involves first identifying the function of problem behavior and then providing that reinforcer contingent on an alternative response to replace problem behavior. When implementing FCT procedures, it is important to deliver the reinforcer that maintains problem behavior on a dense schedule following alternative communication responses. In addition, the behavior analyst should decrease verbal prompts to use the functional communication response as soon as the response is in the individual's repertoire. FCT may be used alongside other behavior reduction procedures, such as in a treatment package. Finally, one may thin the schedule of reinforcement for the alternative response once the response is firmly in the individual's repertoire.